My name is Sarah, and I'm 32 years old. I'm telling this now because enough time has passed that I can talk about it without my hands shaking. It started with a conversation I've replayed in my head at least 1,000 times. I was 23, sitting in my parents' kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon after work. My mom was at the sink, my dad was reading the newspaper at the table, and I was nervous in a way that made my stomach feel tight. I'd been planning to say something for weeks, rehearsing it in my car in the shower before bed, but when the moment actually came, I just blurted it out. I think Dad's business partner is stealing from him. I remember the exact sound of my mom's hand pausing under the running water. My dad didn't look up from his newspaper. The silence stretched out long enough that I wondered if they'd actually heard me. Then my dad laughed, not a real laugh, more like a dismissal made into sound. "That's ridiculous, Sarah. You don't know anything about business," he said, turning a page he hadn't actually read. My mom shut off the water and turned around, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Why would you say something like that? Frank has been friends with your father for 20 years. They started that company together." I tried to explain. I told them about the time I'd gone to pick up my dad's wallet from his office because he'd left it at home, and I'd seen spreadsheets on Frank's desk. I'd only glanced at them, but the numbers didn't match what my dad had mentioned at dinner the week before. Smaller numbers, by maybe $20,000. "You looked at private business documents," my dad said, and suddenly I was the one in trouble, not Frank. I wasn't trying to snoop, I just saw them when— "You should not have been looking at anything," my mom interrupted. "You're being very dramatic about something you don't understand. Frank is family to us, he would never do that." I tried again. I talked about the discrepancies, about how Frank had been taking extended lunches, about how I'd noticed my dad seemed stressed in a way that was new and different. I was working as an accounts manager at a small marketing firm at the time, not exactly high finance, but I understood basic math. I understood what those numbers meant. "Your father trusts Frank. If you can't support him by believing in his judgment, then you shouldn't say things like this," my mom said. And then she turned back to the sink, which somehow made it worse than if she'd yelled. My dad folded his newspaper. "I'm disappointed in you, Sarah. I thought you were smarter than this. You're letting your imagination run away with you." I left their house that night feeling like I'd been turned inside out. The thing about being told you're wrong when you know you're right is that it doesn't just make you feel stupid, it makes you feel unseen. Like the person who's supposed to know you, the person who raised you, suddenly can't recognize what's actually standing in front of them. I didn't bring it up again, not because I stopped believing what I'd seen, but because I understood that saying anything else would only deepen the distance that had opened between us in those few minutes in the kitchen. My parents had always been people I trusted completely. My dad had built his business from nothing, a manufacturing company that made components for the automotive industry. He was someone people respected. My mom was a teacher, a woman who believed in truth and ethics, or at least that's what I'd always thought. They loved me. They showed up. They weren't the kind of parents who were cruel or openly dismissive, which made the dismissal hurt more somehow. It would have been easier to dismiss them in return. Instead, over the next 6 months, I watched my dad slowly fall apart without being able to help him. He started coming home later. He lost weight. At Christmas, he was quiet in a way that seemed hollow. I'd bring up casual things, a movie I'd seen, something from work, and he'd respond, but there was no spark there. It was like talking to someone who was only partially present. I wanted to ask my mom if she'd noticed, but I was afraid. Afraid that if I brought it up again, I'd be the person who was causing problems, not the person who'd been trying to prevent them. So I stayed quiet and watched my dad's company slowly sink. The collapse happened in February. Frank had been embezzling for years, it turned out, nearly $300,000 over the course of a decade. When my dad's accountant finally caught it, after I'd mentioned my concerns so long ago, it was too late. Frank had moved money around carefully. He'd made some investments that had gone bad. The company was in trouble. My dad had to liquidate assets just to stay afloat. I was at my apartment when my dad called me. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it, old and broken. "I want you to know," he said slowly, "that I was wrong not to listen to you." I remember standing there, phone to my ear, feeling nothing at first, and then feeling everything. Because he was right, he had been wrong, but this apology came too late to change anything. It came after he'd already lost the thing he'd spent his entire adult life building. It came after months of suffering that might have been prevented. "Why didn't you listen?" I asked. I wasn't angry exactly. I was something beyond angry, a kind of hollow hurt that felt permanent. "Because I didn't want to believe it," he said. "Because Frank was my friend, and I couldn't accept that someone I trusted that much could betray me." There was something in his voice that made me understand that he wasn't really talking to me anymore. He was talking to himself, working through his own failure. "I should have trusted you," he continued. "I should have trusted your eyes and your instincts, but I was too proud and I thought I knew better, and now everything is." He didn't finish the sentence. When I hung up the phone, I cried for a long time, not because my dad had apologized, but because the apology changed nothing. The loss was already there, and underneath that grief was something else, something sharper and darker, a resentment that I didn't know how to process. My parents, who had always seemed so solid and right and good, had failed me when I needed them. Not in a dramatic way, they hadn't been abusive or neglectful in the way that made for good recovery narratives. They'd just chosen not to believe me. They'd chosen their faith in someone else over faith in me, and that choice had consequences that rippled outward. The next few years are harder to talk about because they're less dramatic but somehow more damaging. My relationship with my parents continued, but something had fundamentally shifted. I'd call on Sundays, I'd go home for holidays, but there was a distance now that hadn't been there before. Not angry distance, just a kind of careful, measured distance, like we were all pretending that September afternoon in the kitchen had never happened, while also never quite moving past it. And underneath it all, I was angry. Not the kind of anger that burns hot and fast, the kind that settles into your bones and becomes part of your architecture, the kind that whispers to you at 3 a.m. about all the ways you've been failed. I was also, I realize now looking back, depressed, but I didn't know what to call it then. I just knew that I felt flat most of the time, that things that had interested me before, nights out with friends, my job, hobbies, felt increasingly pointless. I was going through the motions of being a person, but I didn't feel like I was actually living. What I did feel like doing was building something, not for them, I told myself, for me, to prove that I didn't need their belief or their validation or their support. I started small. I was already working in marketing, so I began taking on freelance clients in my off hours. I was good at it, or at least I became good at it through obsessive practice. I'd work until midnight on nights after my regular job ended. I'd spend entire weekends building portfolios and pitching my services. I made barely any money those first 2 years. Sometimes I'd earn just enough to cover the cost of the coffee I drank while doing the work. But I kept going. I was running from something, I know that now, and running towards something, though I couldn't have articulated what it was then. Some version of myself that didn't need other people's belief to exist, some version of myself that could stand alone and know I was real anyway. When I was 26, I took the leap. I quit my job and started my own marketing firm. It was stupid and terrifying, and my parents reacted with exactly the kind of worried support that somehow felt worse than their earlier dismissal. "That's very ambitious," my mom said, which was her way of saying it's very risky and I don't think you'll succeed. My dad asked practical questions about my savings and my business plan, and I could feel him trying not to say, "I told you so," about the dangers of not having a secure job. They weren't mean about it. They weren't unsupportive, exactly. But they didn't believe in me either, and after everything that had happened, that disbelief felt like it had teeth. The first 5 years were brutal. I worked 80-hour weeks. I made mistakes that cost me money and clients. I learned brutal lessons about negotiation and cash flow and the reality of being a business owner. There was a moment in year 3 when I had so little money left that I was eating ramen for dinner and breakfast, and I remember sitting in my tiny apartment and laughing at the irony. Here I was, building my own empire because my parents hadn't believed in me, and I was barely keeping myself alive in the process. But I wasn't doing it for them anymore. Somewhere along the way, probably around year 2, it had stopped being about revenge or proving anything. It had become about me, about building something I could control, something that made sense, something that was mine in a way nothing else could be. My business turned around in year 5. I'd hired a small team, 3 people I trusted, and we'd started winning bigger contracts. By year 7, we had 12 employees and we'd been nominated for a business award. By year 10, we were operating across 3 states, and I was being asked to speak at conferences about entrepreneurship and small business growth. I still called my parents on Sundays. I didn't tell them much about my business, though. They'd ask general questions and I'd give them general answers. They'd mention things they'd heard from mutual friends about my success, and I'd acknowledge them without really engaging. My mom had aged noticeably. There was a fragility to her that hadn't been there before. My dad had aged differently, more quietly, less visibly. They'd retired around the same time, and they seemed smaller to me somehow, even though I hadn't seen them in person in quite a while. I'd been so focused on building my empire that I'd stopped going home for holidays. I'd miss Christmas and Easter and Thanksgiving, and they'd be hurt, but I'd send gifts and we'd talk on the phone, and everyone would pretend that was enough. It wasn't until I was 31 that something shifted in me. I was sitting in my office looking at the company we'd built, and I realized that I wasn't actually happy. I was successful, I was respected, I had money in the bank, I had employees who depended on me, I had built exactly what I'd set out to build. And I was profoundly, achingly lonely. It's not like I woke up one morning and suddenly forgave my parents, or suddenly wanted to go back to pretending everything was fine. But I did start asking myself a different question. Not why didn't they believe me, but why am I still running? I was 31 years old, and I'd structured my entire adult life around my parents' failure to believe in me as a teenager. I'd built my success as a kind of monument to their doubt. And in doing that, I'd isolated myself from them in a way that felt eerily similar to how they'd isolated me from understanding, from being believed. The difference was that I was doing it intentionally. I was punishing them by succeeding without them, which meant they were living with the consequences of my success without any of the benefits of connection. I didn't call them with a grand announcement. I called them on a regular Sunday and I said, "I'm coming home next month, I want to visit." There was a long pause and then my mom said, "That would be wonderful. How long can you stay?" "A week," I said. "I want to spend some time with you both." When I drove up to their house, it felt like stepping into a strange alternate timeline. The neighborhood looked smaller than I remembered. Their house looked older. My mom was waiting on the porch, and when she saw me, she cried. Not dramatically, but real tears. My dad came out behind her, and he looked at me like he was seeing something he'd been waiting a long time to see. We didn't talk about the past that first day. We made dinner together and talked about safe things. But that night, sitting on the back porch with my dad, he brought it up unprompted. "Your mom told me you've been quite successful," he said. He wasn't looking at me when he said it. "Yeah," I said, "we've done well." "I always thought you would be," he said. And then after a pause, "I knew it even when I said those things, when I refused to listen about Frank. I think maybe that's what made it harder to believe you about him, because I knew what you were capable of and I was afraid of what that meant." I didn't say anything, so he kept going. "You were always the smartest person in the room, Sarah, even as a kid, and I think that scared me. I wanted to be the one who had the answers. I wanted to be the one you needed, and when you started having answers before me, answers about things I didn't want to be true," he trailed off and finally looked at me. "I made a choice to dismiss you instead of accept that I was wrong. That was my failure, not yours." I listened to him, and I felt something in my chest loosen that I didn't even know had been tight. "I spent a lot of years being angry about that," I said. "I built everything partly to prove something to you, to show you that I didn't need your belief." "I know," my dad said. "Your mom figured that out years ago. She used to say that you were building your whole life as an answer to our question, that you were trying to make yourself so successful we couldn't ignore you." "Was I wrong to do that?" I asked. "No," he said, "but it cost you something, and it cost us something too." I stayed that week and the next week and the week after that. I took a month off work and just lived with my parents like I hadn't done since I was a child. My mom and I cooked together. My dad and I took walks through the neighborhood and he talked about retiring, about the things he wanted to do with the time he'd regained. We didn't solve everything. I didn't suddenly feel totally healed or like everything was fine. But we started rebuilding something that had been broken for nearly a decade. The twist came 3 weeks into my visit. I was in the basement looking for some boxes of old things, and I found a file folder with my name on it. It contained printouts of every article about my company that had been published, every conference announcement with my name, every award we'd won. Some of them went back years, longer than my parents had ever mentioned these successes to me. I brought the folder upstairs and found my mom in the kitchen. "Did you know about these?" I asked. She looked at the folder and her face went red. Your father collects them, she said quietly. He has a whole box in his office. I went upstairs and found the box. It was full, probably 100 clippings, printouts, emails they'd sent to each other about things they'd heard. There were notes in my dad's handwriting, proud observations about something I'd accomplished. There were printed reviews of my company's work. There was a photo from a newspaper article about me speaking at a conference, with our daughter written underneath in pen. When I came back downstairs, both my parents were there, and they both looked like they might cry. We were watching, my dad said. The whole time we were so proud of you. And something about that broke me open in a way that nothing else had. They had been watching. They had been following my success, rooting for me, even as I was deliberately keeping them out, even as I was building my success partly as a rejection of them. They had believed in me all along. They'd just failed once, and I'd taken that single failure and built a wall around my entire adult life based on it. I realized that I'd spent 10 years punishing my parents for the thing I'd most wanted from them, belief, by achieving exactly what would make them believe in me, but then refusing to let them actually have that. I'd been the architect of my own isolation. We talked for a very long time that night, not about being right or wrong, but about what had happened to all of us, about how fear had made my parents refuse to believe me initially, and how that refusal had made me afraid in ways I was still working through, about how building my empire had been necessary. I don't think I could have survived emotionally without that structure, without that proof that I was capable of something. But it had also isolated me in a way that wasn't sustainable. I need to tell you something, I said at one point. I've spent the last 10 years being angry at you. I built my entire company partly as revenge, to show you what you dismissed. My mom reached over and squeezed my hand. We know, she said, and we think that was okay. We think you needed to do that, because what you created is real and it's yours and nobody can take that away. But honey, you don't have to prove anything to us anymore. When I left to go back to my life, things were different. Not perfect, there's still a layer of something complicated between my parents and me, something that comes from that deep hurt and can't entirely go away. But it's been transformed into something else. It's not anger anymore, it's more like a scar that's healed but is still visible. I brought my parents into my business in small ways. My mom started helping with some of our non-profit marketing work. My dad served as a consultant for a few clients, which gave him a sense of purpose in his retirement. They came to some of my speaking engagements. They got to know my employees. They became real to my success in a way they hadn't been before. I also realized something important. I didn't actually need them to believe in me anymore. I believed in myself. That was the real empire I'd built. Not the company, not the success, but the deep foundational knowledge that I was capable of something, that I was smart and strong and resilient. The last laugh, if there even is one, isn't actually that satisfying. My parents weren't destroyed by my success. They weren't humbled by being proven wrong. They were just sad that they'd missed 10 years of meaningful connection with their daughter, and I was sad that I'd let anger and hurt dictate the shape of my life for so long. But there's peace in it too. The kind of peace that comes from finally setting down something you've been carrying for a very long time. I still check in with my parents regularly now. I go home for holidays. I let them be part of my life and I let myself be part of theirs. The girl who sat in that kitchen at 23 and felt unseen isn't gone. She's still part of me, but she's not the only thing anymore. There's also the woman I became, strong, capable, independent. And maybe most importantly, there's the woman who learned that success without connection is just a very elaborate way of being lonely. That's the real story. Not the revenge, not the empire, but the slow, quiet discovery that the thing I was running from all along was also the thing I most needed.